see all of you tonight. We're in the book of Isaiah. Numbers down a little bit tonight. I was talking to Gary right before service. I'm sure glad you sat in your assigned seats, though, because it's just pure chaos when you don't. I don't know where anybody is or anything like that. But it'd be okay, by the way, if you came in on a Wednesday and just came down here where I am. That'd be all right. I wouldn't mind that a bit. But anyway, great to see everybody. Appreciate you being here for our study. I've been trying to look at this narrative here in the book of Isaiah, and we've been taking, in a lot of ways, a very broad look at the book, and trying to here lately, especially because right now we're in this big block of chapters that's just judgment, 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 right? That's just God's pronouncements of these judgments on these various nations and peoples and situations. And so we're trying to glean what we can through that, but we're not camping out in any one section for very long as it relates to that. But what I've been doing is I go back in your lesson sheets that we've been handing out on the book of Isaiah, and again, if you don't have that, sometimes see me, and I'll make sure I make a few extra copies of that if you would like one. But we're looking, I think page 33, somebody can help me out there, in your book, is where the questions are that we want to use by review. 32, okay. I going off the top of my head. Yeah, so it would be question 11, I believe, on page 32, maybe somewhere in that range of your book, right? Okay. I didn't bring one up here with me, and I'm sharing something different on the screen. Same questions, just bigger print. By the way, let me know afterwards if that looks easier to read with the black background rather than a white background. It might be easier on your eyes, and so that's something I kind of was messing with a little bit today, and thought I'd give it a try and see if it's a little easier for you to look up there and see with that flipped contrast. And so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, first question for where we left off. Against what nation does Isaiah prophesy next? In chapter 14, verses 24 through 25. That's where we started last week. We're reviewing what we studied last week. So who was that? That was Assyria. What was God going to do? Yeah, right. Judge, destroy, destruction, end, all those kinds of things come to mind in relationship to that. What nation's judgment described in the year Ahaz died? That was Philistia, right? That was being described there in the year that Ahaz died. And what will God do? It's kind of an interesting question, by the way. You have to kind of think about that one a little bit. What was he going to do in that context of that judgment? It's slightly different, and here's how it's different. So run your minds back for a minute. So Ahaz is king over... No, I think he's Judah. I think Ahaz is Judah. And so Ahaz has had this ongoing struggle with the Philistines, right? Philistines, every time they saw them become vulnerable, here they would come and try to create more problems. And now, notice he says this prophecy comes in the year that Ahaz dies. And so they might see that as an opportunity. And God says, Isaiah, go tell them, I'm still going to protect my people. And just because Ahaz died does not mean that they're going to be so weakened and so available. And that judgment against them is more a protective judgment for God's people than it is some kind of outright destructive kind of mode that we've seen in other scenarios, although that comes up as well. But it was just interesting. I didn't talk about that last Wednesday, but it's an interesting because he frames that time period. He doesn't always do that in the prophecy. He doesn't always tell us exactly when certain things are going to occur, but this was specific. In the year that Ahaz dies, go tell Philistia, have any ideas about coming after my people because I'm going to protect them. And there have been struggles for a long time. Against what nation did Isaiah prophesy in chapters 15 and 16? That was Moab, right? That was Moab. And what was that nation's primary sin? Pride, right? Pride was the primary sin that you see there in chapter 16 as it relates to them. And what would happen within 3 years? Yeah, remnant will be small, and all that pride and glory is just gone, right? It doesn't take God long to humble nations and or people. It doesn't take God long to humble nations or people, and we should respect that. And any moment we feel like we're exalting ourselves, or we feel like we're on the top of the world and nothing could challenge us or hinder our faith or create difficulties, be cautious, because we can fall and God can bring down the proud, as he did with Moab. Against what two nations then is Isaiah prophesying in chapter 17? Okay, so Syria, and what reference does he make about Israel? Who's he call them? Well, that's Syria. Damascus is Syria. What other? Ephraim, right? Ephraim. He uses Ephraim to reference Israel, part of that northern tribe. And what will happen to these two nations? Yeah, it's same as ever. Going to make them thin. That's kind of that imagery that he uses as it relates to them. What would happen as a result of this judgment in verses 7 and 8? Yeah, it's one of those moments. It's interesting, right? Because when we studied that last week, most of these judgments are kind of condemning and powerful and destructive. This was going to actually educate them. And they would actually come back, the text says, and actually turn their attentions back to God because of the things that he was bringing against them. That doesn't always happen in relationship to these judgments. Why were their efforts to sow and harvest becoming a heap of ruins? Because they had forgotten God, right? They had forgotten God. So it's kind of this odd thing. They had forgotten him, and consequence came. When they learn their lesson from that, they'll turn their attentions back to him. Against what nation is judgment proclaimed in chapter 18? Okay, that's Ethiopia, right? And Cuth is also used in relationship to that nation of people. And to whom would this nation send ambassadors for help? Yeah, it's interesting, right? Say it again. Yeah, to the enemies of God's people. Maybe you could generalize it that way. He doesn't really what? Doesn't really say. Okay, he doesn't give any specific notion of exactly who. You see some of that description, and who's close by? That's got the rivers. Okay, yeah, Egypt's close by, so you might see that imagery in relationship to them. But I think the point that really that Isaiah is making is, these were people that were always trying to make allegiances and grow close to different entities. And God says, that's not going to work for you when I bring this judgment. What would the Lord do? Question 21. Okay. And so he would take away their harvest, and then who would bring a present to Mount Zion? Yeah, the nation that had been the nation that had been seeking to send ambassadors to join themselves to all these other nations finally realizes, oh, we ought to really be sending ambassadors before Jehovah. We ought to be sending our gifts before his altar, is the decisions that we ought to be making. Against what nation is judgment proclaimed in chapter 19? That's Egypt, right? And how is the Lord depicted as coming in judgment upon this nation? On a what? On a swift cloud, he says, as it relates to that. And in what two forms would judgment against this nation take place? Okay, so internal strife, right? We talked about that last Wednesday. Internal strife, and then and what else then? Okay, and some of that... their economy is going to suffer. Who were they always turning to when they had problems? Yeah, all those wise men of the land, right? They always had these wise men. Remember, even when Moses goes into Egypt, they always have these guys that they're turning to, and God says, that's not going to work out for you. And so both of those things were addressed as it relates to that. That brings us up to where we left off then last Wednesday. That's the summary. I can't get that to come up long enough for me to switch. As it relates to those things. So let's continue then through the narrative that we've been studying. We're still in chapter 19. I didn't quite get all of it in last Wednesday night. But I want you to notice just a couple of things. And again, I'm going to show you on the screen kind of an abridged look. We won't look verse by verse at all of these texts. But I do want you to notice a couple of things as it relates to this. So verse 21 of chapter 19. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to the Lord. And he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. In that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria. And the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria. And the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. Now, again, you only get small, brief moments of that kind of language in these prophecies that we're going through, right? Generally speaking, almost everything in all of these chapters from about chapter 12 to 29 is some judgment against somebody. But there are moments where God says, some people are actually going to learn from all of this. And they're going to come back and be a people unto me. It sounds odd, right? To think that Egypt is going to be a people that God will recognize as His. Assyria is going to be a people that God will recognize as His. Israel will be able to come back after their condemnation and the remnant of them that survive, and they're going to have an opportunity to be the people of God. In fact, over the time span since then, much of what we have found archaeologically wise has been found in Egypt. Some of the transcripts and things that we have and ways we've been able to come to our English translations of the Scriptures came from things that were found in Egypt. And they became a people unto God and even served a purpose that actually preserved. There's lots of debates and arguments, and I'm not going to go down the road with you tonight on the various translations and where the various scripts and papyrus and all those kinds of things come from. But just know that Isaiah very clearly says, in one form or another, Egypt is going to serve God's purposes for at least a period of time. And they're going to be considered part of God's people for a period of time after this judgment arrives against them. It's just fascinating to think about. All the difficulties. When we think of Egypt, we don't typically think of them as being anything relating to what God would want. And yet here Isaiah says that's exactly what they'll become.
They'll be the last people we think.
Yeah, in some ways. And I just didn't get a chance to note that with you last Wednesday. Thoughts or questions about chapter 19? Yes?
The Egyptians and the Assyrians, nationally, what were they?
Egyptians and Assyrians.
Were they Gentiles?
Well, yes, if that's what you're asking. Yes.
These were not, although undoubtedly through all of these various captivities and scatterings of God's people at various moments in time, there were pockets of Hebrews, Jews, Israelites, whichever phrase you want to use in relationship to God's people, that migrated into all these regions. And so you would find they didn't just stay in one location. During all these various moments in history of the judgments that God brought against His own people, those remnants would scatter. And there's evidence that they had made their way clear into Egypt at times, certain portions of them. And so you'd have some of that connectivity. I don't think that's the way he's speaking here. I don't think he's talking about just this remnant of Jews that happened to land in Egypt or Assyria. These are folks that are not native to God's people, but they become such for God's purposes.
We can see that some of that truth was in Egypt because through a person from Ethiopia, from
Yeah.
Tanzania,
Yeah. Yeah, when we speak
about conversions, one of the first ones we think of is the Ethiopian eunuch, right? When we talk about those, and he was reading from the book of Isaiah when he was encountered there by Philip the evangelist there on the road. So it's interesting that there were obviously in the days of Jesus, Jewish folks that had found themselves even in Ethiopia, and there would be one specific example of that as it relates to that. So chapter 20 becomes interesting in this sense. Isaiah actually now is going to become a sign of God's judgment against Egypt and Ethiopia. If you look at verses 2 and 3 of chapter 20, then the Lord said, as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian captives and the Cushite exiles, both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, the nakedness of Egypt. And so, when you think about that, you think of somebody who has nothing, right? That's the imagery here. They have nothing, and so that at the end of the judgment, they have nothing, and they have one place to turn. Where is it? It's to God, right? It's to God. Seeing how that's going to kind of become fulfilled ultimately, but they're going to become so destitute, they're going to ultimately come back to the only place they can find. And Isaiah is going to be an imagery of that, of a sign to them of this time period in which they will finally become so destitute that they would realize there's only one place to go. That isn't a recommended way to come to know God, but it is the way that many have found Him. And I think in Scripture of the prodigal, right? The prodigal had to hit what point in his life in order to turn to God? He had to hit the bottom. He had to hit the bottom. And once he hit bottom, right, when the prodigal hit bottom, he realized that even the hired servants in my father's house have food to eat. They've got. Here I am. I'd fill my belly with the husks that I'm feeding these swine if somebody would let me. He hit rock bottom. I will go before my Father and say, I've sinned against you and against heaven, right? That whole conversation. Well, that's the same imagery here. The Egyptians and the Ethiopians will become so empty and such need that they'll go to the one source, ultimately, he said in the prior chapter, that can actually aid them when they hit that point. And Isaiah becomes this interesting example of that. During Judah's captivity, there are some exiles. Some leave. So name me some of the folks that end up like in Babylonian Chaldean captivity. Who are that? Right. That's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those guys, right? They get the benefit of that Chaldean education, and Daniel actually rises up in power. They have a different experience than a guy like Ezekiel, right? Who has a completely different kind of experience, or Jeremiah, who would have a different kind of experience as well. But I remind you of Ezekiel because there were moments where Ezekiel had to do some interesting things, right? Lay on your side for X amount of days, for every year that the people are going to suffer, flip over and lay on your other side for 390 days, right? And so we see that kind of imagery happening of this time period, where God actually asks of the prophet to do something very specific as a sign or an image of whatever judgment he was going to be bringing. And Isaiah fits that mold here in chapter 20 as well, as he becomes a very vivid imagery of what these nations will become before they turn back to God. Chapter 21, then, brings the judgment against Babylon. And we know from history that that's the Medes and the Persians, right? Elam, I think, is used in relationship to some translations. Some texts will use that to refer to these Medes and Persians. It's interesting. why Elam? And I think because Isaiah's prophesying about things that will, some of it's going to happen in the immediate, some of it's going to happen within a few years, some of it's going to happen in a year of Ahaz and other kings that die. And so his prophecies aren't necessarily given to us in some kind of chronological form, where the first one happens and then the next one happens and then the next. No, he's just kind of loading us up on all these various judgments and prophecies concerning these nations, and those judgments, events, are going to happen on all kinds of time periods over the course of many, many years. And so if he would have referenced the Persians at the point in time he's writing this, nobody would have had a clue who he was talking about, because they have yet to even rise up to be a people to be referenced. And so he uses Elam to kind of reference them in a region so that people would know, okay, from that area there's going to be a group that will rise up and deal with the Babylonians. But in the moment, he couldn't reference them because they would have been an unknown to the people that he's writing this prophecy to. And I just got to thinking about that, because that's an interesting facet sometimes, right? When you're talking about prophecies that point to the future, if they're going to aid the people in the immediate, then there's got to be some kind of connectivity they can make. And so rather than point to a non-existent nation in the moment, he points to an area in which they would be able to understand and conclude what general vicinity this nation would rise up with the Medes and deal with the Babylonians at that time. Notice some specific language about it. Verse 2, Isaiah chapter 21. So he says, a stern vision is told to me. The traitor betrays, and the destroyer destroys. Go up, O Elam, lay siege, O Media. All the sighing she has caused, I bring to an end. All the betrayal. God had blessed Babylon, and they ignored him. God allowed for Babylon to even bring judgment against God's own people, and they didn't give God the credit for it. And so God has repeatedly, through Isaiah and other prophets, talked about how the fact that he'll use Babylon for as long as he needs them, and then because of their rejection of him, they'll suffer their own consequences because of their decision making, and an end would ultimately come to them because of that. Look at verse 5 for a minute, and then I'm going to back up on this. I put those things out of order, but look at verse 5 of chapter 21. They prepare the table. They spread the rugs. They eat, they drink. Arise, O princes, oil the shield. Who's that sound like? Doesn't that sound like exactly what was going on in the days of Belshazzar? In Daniel chapter 5? Remember, they had even brought the utensils from the temple, and he's throwing a big old feast and a big old celebration, and they're drinking their wine out of the cups and stuff they brought out of the temple, and they're just having a great old party, and then all of a sudden what comes out? Yeah, hand, finger writing on the wall. And they have to look around to try to find somebody to interpret it, and all kinds of guys come in, and they can't figure it out. And finally say, you got a guy that's been around a while, name of Daniel, right? And he can come, he'll help you understand these things that were written. But this judgment against Babylon, it sounds a lot like what Isaiah is describing here in verse 5, is exactly what happened when the Medes and Persians begin to invade and Belshazzar falls and Babylon ultimately falls. This description is exactly the events recorded for us in like Daniel. So it's just interesting to me, even though Isaiah is writing about things that are going to yet to come, you can go and see those events in history unfold in different narratives and see exactly the things that Isaiah is speaking of. And the absolute disregard for God that not only Nebuchadnezzar had, but ultimately Belshazzar had in Babylon as well. Verse 6 tells Isaiah, set a watchman. Notice he doesn't say he's not going to be the what? He's not the watchman, right? These events will happen. You set a watchman to watch out for these things that are going to happen to Babylon and then declare them. And let people know, basically, when you see Babylon begin to fall. And remember, we've already seen earlier judgments about Babylon, right? Remember we talked about that out of chapter 14, about some of those confusing languages and things that reference Babylon there in chapter 14. And he says it's like the morning star fell out of the sky. That's how hard it's going to be when Babylon falls to God's judgment. He's adding more information to that judgment against Babylon here, and he tells Isaiah, listen, get a watchman, tell people to be ready to when they start to see Babylon fall, to tell people what? That's who? Working. That's God's working, right? That's God working. Have people ready when they begin to witness these things happening, even to the great Babylon. Have them ready to be able to declare that's the work of God, not just the work of the Medes and Persians and the work of men. In the text then, if you just keep moving, he gives this brief judgment. Doesn't really say, just he references Edom and moves on. He doesn't elaborate. He gives a judgment of Arabia and then just kind of moves on. Doesn't really elaborate a lot in relationship to those things. So let me take a quick moment and just kind of remind you of where it is that we're talking about. We showed this map to you last week, and I'll show it to you again tonight, just to kind of get all these places that we've been discussing in your mind. So here's Jerusalem and Judah, okay? To the north, Israel, often referred to as Ephraim, that portion of the tribe that Ephraim was who, by the way? Not to insult your intelligence. Yeah, that's right. And Ephraim and Manasseh, right? Those two brothers got Joseph's portion and became, in essence, they become Joseph. If you look at the 12 tribes of Israel that we often think about, who usually gets left out of that when you're looking at a map? Joseph and Levi, right? Because the Levites didn't get any specific land. The Levites, the priests, were scattered all over the nation. And so they didn't get a specific. So when you're looking at a map and you think the 12 tribes of Israel, the missing two are Joseph and Levi, but the two added are Manasseh and Ephraim, the sons of Joseph that received that. And you can remember some of that history. So that's to the north of Judah, right? Down here's Moab to the south. Edom's down here, or Duma, who we're talking about right now, down here to the south. Egypt is over in here. I blew up the map too big. Ethiopia just below that region. I just blew the map up a little too big to show that. Babylon over here. We spoke about that last week. Here's that area, Persia, that these folks, when Isaiah's writing, don't even understand who these people are yet. Right? He references them in a different way. Syria way to the north. The Medes, even further to the north, above Assyria. Syria itself, sometimes those are tricky, right, when we're saying Syria and Assyria, but they're two different nations of people. But they're sometimes simply referred to their capital city, if you will, their main city, Damascus. So sometimes in the text you'll see Damascus, which is really referring generally to Syria itself. They're primary. Philistia here on the border, okay? Very close, right, to Israel and Judah, right along the Mediterranean. And because they were that proximity, they seem to always be a thorn in the side. Remember, that's who was from there. Goliath, right? I was hoping somebody would realize me stretching to the sky. I was trying to give you Goliath in charades. But anyway, right, so that's where Goliath came from. So, but it's amazing when you think about, this is not a large landmass, okay? This is not, an enormous landmass, and all of these people seem to at one time or another have problems with God's people and have difficulty. Go ahead, Bill.
They're right, that's the very places that take place. The area that the Philistines one time occupied.
And
That general vicinity is still struggling to this day with various challenges as it relates to that. We're going to see in a little bit Tyre and Sidon. I'm going to bring the map back up. I'm just going to show it to you now. They're right along with Philistia as well, just to the north of there. And we'll see them here in a few minutes in our study. But just wanted to throw that map back up to you. And anybody at home saw the map, but they're thinking, what's he talking about? Because they couldn't see me pointing to anything. So in chapter 22, primarily been dealing throughout all these narratives, judgments against other nations, not God's people, other nations. Chapter 22 turns his attention on Jerusalem. And it's interesting, if you look at the language, what's going to happen and the vision of what's going to happen as it hits Isaiah, it's so sad to him that he doesn't even want anybody to look at him as he mourns over the people. Notice verse 4, chapter 22. Therefore said I, look away from me. I will weep bitterly. Labor not to comfort me because of the spoiling of the daughter of my people. For it is a day of trouble and of treading down and of perplexity by the Lord God of hosts in the valley of vision, breaking down the walls and of a crying to the mountains. When God brings this judgment against Jerusalem, and Judah finally falls, and Jerusalem finally falls, Isaiah says it's going to be so sad that it will bring him to such mourning and sorrow. He says, don't even look at me. Don't try to comfort me. That's how dark it will be to him in that moment. In verses 8 through 11, you kind of get the reasoning what's going on with the people that God would bring this. So they hear this judgment's coming, and here's what they do. There's 4 things that they look to. The first is the armor of the house of the forest. Remember, they had constructed some pretty fortified places, even within the city walls. And they had used the where? Cedars of Lebanon, right? They had gone and gotten the cedars of Lebanon. Solomon spared no expense. And I say Solomon spared no expense, but who set him up for that, by the way? God did, and David did. His father, if you remember, David wanted to build the temple. And God says, no, not my plan for you to build the temple. Your son can build it. But rather than complain about that, David just starts setting aside the materials and beginning the process of drawing up the plans and getting things ready for them to build all of these things. And he brought, spared no expense and lots of labor to build these very strong cedar structures, and including even an armory within the walls where they could go and get the various weaponry of the day that they would have access to. Solomon builds that and continues through the years. And so that's the imagery, right? Well, when this battle comes to Jerusalem, we'll just run to the armory, get what we need, and we'll protect ourselves. They were pooling water. They said there were breaches. The text says there were breaches in the waterways. And so rather than fix those, they were just kind of pooling the water into the lower pool, I believe the text says. They were just stockpiling, right? You're in a walled city. You can't get out. It may work for a while to keep people out, but you can't get out either. And so, well, we're okay. We've pooled enough water to supply the city. We're okay. Well, what about breaches in the wall? Well, some of the houses inside of Jerusalem were built out of stone, okay? They were built out of stone. So let's just go knock down Bill's house, take the stone, and we'll go. There wasn't anybody named Bill, I don't think, there in Jerusalem, but anyway. But right, you get the picture. Let's go knock down his house. We'll take the stone from his place, and we'll fill the weaknesses and voids in the wall. It won't be a problem. 11 specifically. You made also a ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. You think you're fine because you've built some pretty strong fortified areas within the city. You've got an armory within one of those fortified places. You feel like you're fine. You've pooled enough water that you can sustain yourselves for a period of time. You've thought out a plan. If there's any weaknesses in the wall, we've got these homes that are built out of stone. We'll just knock those down and go fix the wall when we need to fix the wall. We've done all of these things, right? We've even built this ditch between the two walls for the water of the old pool. But here's the problem up through it all. But you have not looked unto the maker thereof, neither had respect unto him that fashioned it long ago. Who put the cedars there to begin with? Who brought the water supply to them? Who allowed for them to build this fortified? They felt like they had accomplished all that and could sustain themselves no matter what. God says, you paid no respect to me whatsoever when it came to all of those things that I've benefited you and blessed you in. Gave me no credit. All the while, you've ignored the calls for repentance. He said, you should have been mourning, but rather you were eating and drinking. Notice verse 12, chapter 22. And in that day did the Lord God of hosts call to weeping, and to mourning, and to baldness, and to girding with sackcloth. And behold, joy and gladness, slaying oxen, and killing sheep, eating flesh and drinking wine. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. He called them to repentance. They called themselves to feasting. He called them to weep and to mourn and to sorrow over the condition of the people. They decided that they should just keep doing everything that made them happy, because at the end of the day we might be gone, right? It sounds similar to a New Testament parable, right? The man who kept having bigger crops and building bigger barns and storing up more stuff. And God called him what? He said, thou fool, this night your life will be... These folks are just living it up, thinking, well, even if I die tomorrow, might as well celebrate today. They should have been weeping and mourning over the condition of the people, and they chose not to. And I think sometimes we too can get so caught up in this world and the things of it and the earthly trappings of it that we might, if we're not careful, find ourselves celebrating what we ought to be mourning over. And we have to be careful that we don't get pulled in to viewing things that God would want us to be humbled and penitent about, where the world is celebrating. And I think there's a valuable lesson for us. Maybe I'll come back to that, Lord willing, next Wednesday.